We're going to finish off this CSS section by looking at something which can trip up a lot of new developers. This is the cascade and specificity. Let's begin with the cascade. The cascade ultimately determines which CSS styles are applied to an element. This is based on a number of factors which we'll look at in this video. For example, if we have multiple CSS selectors all targeting a H1 element, or if we have more than one style sheet, also with some rules for the H1 element, which one will ultimately win? The answer is the most specific. Rules will cascade down from the least or the most general rules through to the most specific rule for the element. Probably the most general and simplest way to decide is the source order. If we have more than one selector pointing to the same element, the last one in our source code will override others before it. Let's go over to our CSS and see this in action. So let's target the H1 element, which is the site title. Set the color to be any value such as red, and then add a second CSS property to set the text decoration to be underlined. Then under this, we can also add a second H1 rule, selecting the color of purple. So now we have two CSS selectors both targeting the H1. So let's reload the browser and see which one takes effect. We can see we have this purple color and also the underline. This is because the code is read from top to bottom, meaning that this text decoration from here will still be used, but this color value of red will then be overridden with this value of purple, which appears after it. We can also see how this works over in the developer tools. If we right click and then inspect, and then if we select this header at the top, or the H1, over on the right hand side we can see the styles which apply. These selectors on the right are all applying to this H1. We will look at the order in which these apply soon, but the thing to note here is this color red has been crossed out, and then the color of purple is then taking effect. This source order also applies when we are running multiple style sheets. If we go over to our index.html and then up to the top section, the bottom style sheet will always override any style sheets from above. This is the reason why we usually want to place our own custom style sheet down at the bottom, so we can add custom styles which will override any from above. The next thing to affect the cascade is specificity. This is how specific a selector is. If we go back over to our styles.css, in our example here, both selectors are H1, therefore they are equally specific. When this happens, as we've just seen, source order will take priority. Let's take a look at how we calculate how specific selectors are. So over on the left we have some examples of a selector, and then on the right hand side we see how many points are applied per selector. So the first example on the first row, we see that a H1 or a P, which is a standard element, has 1 point, and that's 1 point per selector. So currently our H1 is only worth 1 point. On the second row, a class or an attribute, or even a pseudo class, which we've already seen, counts for 10 points. On the third row, we see that an ID selector, such as the product ID, which we've already used, is worth 100 points. Then we see at the bottom 1000 points is for the inline styles. This is when we add the style attribute to a HTML element. We can see from this table here that the H1 just has a single point, and this is what we're currently targeting in the CSS. On the second row we have .container, H1, so we still have our single point for this level 1 heading, which is here. We then also get 10 points for this class, So this is more specific than the H1 because we now have 11 points. Just below this, we've seen before that an ID has 100 points. And then just like we mentioned, a normal CSS selector, such as P, is a single point. This then totals 101 points, making it more valuable than the top two. We also mentioned that a pseudo class such as hover, if we look at the first slide, is worth 10 points. So we have our 10 points here for the pseudo class. And then we have two selectors, which is the LI and then the A, leaving a total value of 12. So back over to our CSS. Let's add some comments to the top of each of these and work out how many points we currently have. So this is worth no hundreds, no tens, and no thousands. So this is currently a single point. And copy this and then paste this below. So we have two equal elements, both worth a single point. We can be more specific by adding a header. So let's add header H1 to the first selector. And now we have two elements, so this now equals 2 points in total. So now this is more specific. So now we should have a color of red with the underline. So let's refresh. And there's our red header color. If we again make the match by adding header to the second element, this is now also worth 2 points, and therefore the source order will then declare purple the winner. So refresh, and there we go. So let's try something else. If we go over to our index.html and then go down to the header, let's add a class to this header, and header is fine. Then we can change the CSS. So the first one, we'll add the dot and make this a class. We still have the single element selector here, which is worth 1 point. But this time we also have a class, which is worth 10 points, equaling 11. So now we have 11 points for the first one. So we should expect the red color to win again. Save that, refresh, and we see that red wins. As we would expect, changing both to be a class with the dot will also make this 11 points, and then refer back to the source order, meaning the color would be purple. So what about an ID? Let's go over to the index.html. Rather than a class, we can change this to be an ID. And then over to the style sheet. So first of all, instead of a dot, we can add a hash because this is an ID. And now we would have a total. This gives us a total of 101. We get 100 points for an ID and 1 for the single selector. Save that, refresh, and now red wins out. Hopefully this is starting to make sense now as we look at more examples. We also seen in the slides that inline styles count for 1,000 points. So these should be the most specific and win out. So let's go over to the H1, which we're currently working with. Add an inline style. So this time we'll set the color property to be blue. So this is now worth 1,000 points. This is worth 101. So now the blue color should win out. So even though this is worth the most points and wins, there is one thing even more dominant. And this is the important declaration. Even though we have this inline style in the HTML, we can add this important declaration into the CSS to indicate that we want this style to win. So after the red, we can add a exclamation mark and then add the important tag. Save that. And now we have the winner as red, even though the points value is even less. So the order of weight is this important declaration first. Then second is how specific the selector is. And then finally the source order. The only way to actually override this important declaration is to also add it again further down in the source order. So let's remove this style from here. And we can also remove this ID of header 2, save that file, and then we can also just go for 2 level 1 headings, and also remove the comments. So now these values are both equal. If we now go ahead and add the important declaration to both of these selectors, the source order should win. So over to the browser and refresh, and now we're back to the purple H1. It's also recommended to only use important as a last resort. We should use more specific selectors wherever possible. This is because it changes the way the cascade works, so debugging can often be more difficult, especially on larger projects. So now let's remove these 2 level 1 headings, and then save that file, and restore our project back to normal. So these are the factors which determine which CSS rules finally make it into the browser for the user to see. It may seem quite complicated, but it really is just a case of understanding how much weight each selector carries.